This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of Coronial. My name is Emma.
I'm Georgie.
And I'm Alice.
In today's episode, we'll be taking a look at the coroner's report regarding the inquest into the deaths of Wilfried and Gisela Thor, who both passed away on the 10th of February 2017 near Trafina Gorge in the Northern Territory. So Wilfried was 75 years old at the time of his death, and his wife Gisela was 73. They were married in 1969 and had 3 children and lived on the eastern edge of Berlin in Germany. On the 1st of February 2017, they took a flight from Berlin via Abu Dhabi to Melbourne. They arrived in Melbourne on the 2nd of February and intended to stay in Australia until the 27th of February. They had a detailed itinerary for their 25-day holiday. They planned to visit Victoria, South Australia, Central Australia, New South Wales and Queensland, covering a fair bit of ground.
Yeah, that's a lot to pack in.
In 25 days, yeah.
Yeah, but I feel like overseas tourists underestimate the size of Australia.
Yeah, true.
It's so common.
Very true.
On the 9th of February, Mr. and Mrs. Thor flew from Adelaide to Alice Springs. They arrived at about 2:55 p.m. The itinerary indicated they allowed for 25 minutes to get out of the airport and pick up a hire car.
I love that it was
had next to every activity, this will take you.
that specific.
Yes. This is so retirement travel.
Yeah, so you say they probably underestimated the time. I think they knew. Because they had detailed it out.
Okay, yeah. They were on top of it.
Yeah, they understood how long it was going to take to fly. They hired a Toyota RAV4 and drove to the tourist park where they had booked accommodation. They had plans the next day, which was the 10th of February, to visit the East McDonnell Ranges near Alice Springs. In particular, they had planned to visit Jessie Gap, Corroboree Rock Conservation Reserve and Trafina Gorge. They then planned to drive back to Alice Springs, which was about 80 kilometres from Trafina Gorge. So at Trafina Gorge, it was noted on their itinerary that things to do were the panorama walk, which would take them 1 hour, and the gorge walk, which would also take them an hour.
I love trips that are scheduled like that. This is so up my alley.
It's very efficient.
So cute. The coroner had put in and at the Corroboree Rock Reserve, there was rock art to be seen.
Aww.
Things like that. And they should take approximately 1 hour.
Should use this inquest as travel planning.
I know. It was very cute. It just it felt, you were like, oh, little old darlings. So Mr. and Mrs. Thor was seen leaving their accommodation at 6 a.m. on Friday the 10th of February in their hire car. Mr. Thor used their camera to take video of the scenery along the way.
Cute.
They were seen by the ranger arriving at the Trafina Gorge day-use car park at around 9:30 a.m. He remembers them in particular because they parked in a car park. They sort of parked in the middle of 2 car parks. So he was they basically double parked and took up 2 car parks.
So he was judging them harshly.
I think he might have been judging them, but he was like, I remember the car because it was parked incorrectly.
That's one way to make yourself memorable.
So by 9:30 in the morning, the temperature was already about 31 degrees Celsius.
Oh, yeah, because it's February, right?
It's February.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
They walked the short distance to the creek bed that leads to the gorge. The last video recorded was of them entering the gorge. There were 2 walks around this area. The gorge stroll is signposted as being about 500 metres in length, and the gorge walk is about 2 kilometres in length. For the gorge stroll, a person would walk from the car park down the sandy creek bed and then turn left and walk up the creek bed and back. So just a nice little sort of stroll up the creek.
But it's not a circuit, it's
no,
up
it's
and
up
back.
and back. The gorge walk is a loop that includes walking through the gorge and then taking a left turn just before the creek bed turns to the right. The walk then goes back along the rim of the gorge. So that one is sort of a loop. There was a sign indicating that the gorge walk could be walked either clockwise or anti-clockwise, which was marked with orange arrows. Because of the relatively short distance of the intended walk, and both Mr. and Mrs. Thor were walkers, so...
Okay.
They
So these
were-
are fit people that...
Yeah.
Well, as fit as
you can be
As
when
you
you're
can
in
be.
your 70s.
Yeah, that's right. But they were sort of experienced walkers.
Yeah.
But because of the short distance, Mrs. Thor had left her proper walking shoes in the car and took only a small 600 milliliter bottle of water.
Oh, no.
In the 31-degree heat, that is a poor choice.
Mm.
Especially when I assume they take the wrong walk and go for the slightly longer version.
Stop predicting.
They took that right instead of left, didn't they?
This is the father and son with hypothermia
It's
all
very
over again.
similar-ish. Mr. and Mrs. Thor walked along the creek bed and through the gorge with a view to completing the walk by looping back along the rim. So they decided to take the longer.
Oh, they did decide to take the second.
Yeah.
Okay.
About 400 metres through the gorge is the trail that leads to the rim. It was on the left side as the creek bed entered a sweeping turn to the right. The only indication of the trail was an orange arrow located several metres up the trail after it had left the creek bed. However, along the side of the creek bed was long grass that significantly obscured the arrow,
Oh, no.
so you couldn't really tell.
And was it that opening also wasn't super obvious?
I think it was obvious, but because they didn't see the arrow, they just kind of kept on following the creek bed rather than going up there, because why would you turn? They presumably thought they were going the right way, but they didn't. So Mr. and Mrs. Thor didn't see the trail and continued to walk along the creek bed through the sweeping right hand and towards the boundary of the national park. There was usually a wire stock fence that went along the creek bed and up the sides of the rock formation bounding the creek bed to sort of signify the boundary of the national park. And there was generally a laminated sign to indicate that the fence marked the boundary of the park and warning people not to go any further. However, at this time, the fence was down and the sign was gone due to flooding in the area 2 weeks earlier.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
That's just bad timing.
Mm-hmm. So the couple kept walking until the creek bed split in two and went around a small island. Once around the island, the creek joined back together as one, but by that point the terrain became impassable, so the Thors turned around and went back.
Right, at this point they've realised they're going the wrong way.
They're not on the right path.
Okay, well, that's a good choice. Turn around, go back the way you came.
By this point, Mr. and Mrs. Thor had walked at least 5 kilometres, so longer than the 2K
That they'd planned.
that they had planned.
With
to
600
walk.
mils of water and 31-degree heat.
And 2 of them.
Yeah.
I'm guessing
Yeah,
he didn't have a water bottle.
No, he didn't. So it was just 600 mils between the both. So because of that, during that time, they had stopped at a number of areas where there was still some water in the creek to refill that water bottle, which wouldn't have been
tasty, but would have been better than
It was
nothing.
better than nothing, right? Their movements are known because there were footprints in the creek bed, and theirs were the only footprints in the creek bed
Okay.
at that point. So maybe they would have figured out that they were also lost at that point, but who knows?
Yeah, fair.
Because there were no other sort of footprints around. When the creek bed became impassable, they turned back and followed the creek bed back around the island. 400 metres up the track from that point, Mrs. Thor took a right turn and walked out of the creek bed. She followed a small sandy trail for a short distance. However, that trail gave way to rocks, tall grass and small trees. It's not known why she left the creek bed, but by that time it was likely very hot, so the temperature for that day rose to 39.9 degrees. She wasn't wearing a hat
Oh, no.
and may have been suffering from heat stress and dehydration by that point.
Yeah.
Almost
But also was she
guaranteed.
just like trying to look for how do we get back? Like, is this a cut through?
Yeah, or maybe she's even trying to get some elevation out of the creek bed to see
Yeah.
what she can see.
Mm-hmm. Don't know
Yeah,
what
who
the
knows?
shade was like. Maybe she was just like, I just need to sit down under
Somewhere.
some shade. But Mr. Thor kept on walking along the creek bed. He likely did not notice Mrs. Thor leaving the creek, so she's obviously not indicated to him.
Oh, never split up.
But I'm also like, Mr. and Mrs. Thor are having a bitch at each other because they've
Yeah,
got
possibly.
themselves lost. and they're just like at each other's throats. And so she's like, I'm going to walk this way, which I have never been on a walk like that before.
So Mr. Thor travelled another 700 metres before turning back and retracing his steps. They could again tell this by his footprints.
Wow.
And he retraced his steps, and the way his footprints went, he's gone and was looking up each little pathway.
Trying to find her.
Trying to find her. Eventually he arrived back at the island and then followed another larger pathway. Mrs. Thor continued to make her way through the rocky country, so she didn't stop.
Oh, she started
no.
bush bashing.
She started bush bashing for about another 900 metres before sitting under the shade of a small tree. At this point, she was only 20 metres away from a graded track, but she obviously didn't know.
Yeah.
Oh,
You know that?
You can
so
be
close,
that close.
yet so far.
Yeah, but you can't see it. So
You
But
have
she
no
couldn't
idea.
see it. So after sitting under the tree, at some point she fell sideways, and this was the position that she was found in deceased. From the point of leaving the car to where she was found, she had walked about 10 kilometres.
That isn't
That's-
a lot.
yeah, in that
Yeah.
kind of heat.
And it's not just like a walk along the road or something. She's
Yeah,
been bush bashing it,
Yeah.
And she's in her 70s.
40 degrees and
dehydrated.
yeah.
And I'm
lost.
guessing they had no
No
food
hat.
with them either.
No.
Not
They
the
thought they were just
appropriate
going
shoes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds horrible.
Just very, very underprepared. Mr. Thor continued to walk along the other pathway. There was no water in that area that he was walking around now. And so 3.5 kilometres later, he left the track. He walked up a small hill and sat on a rock. He lay back on the rock and was found deceased in that position. He had walked around 17 kilometres.
Wow.
Damn.
That is. I'm just like so impressed by how far they got, but then also so devastated for them.
It's devastating as well that they're apart.
Yeah.
But they probably were delirious. Like,
Yeah, they
sure,
would have been.
I made the point of them getting upset with each other, but they're probably separated because they've got delirious because they started feeling the effects of the heat. Yeah.
And they were just trying to get out of the heat. And
Yeah.
they weren't making rational decisions because otherwise you would have just
Yeah.
literally gone the way you had come.
Yeah.
And you would know that you're going to get back to your car.
And the fact that they could see footprints, you're sort of like, why didn't you just follow your footprints back? But
Oh, I would not be that smart. I would not think that.
No,
I mean,
me neither.
I might now, but honestly, like, have I got no sense of direction and been lost on a walk before, even recently? And I'd backtrack, but I wouldn't have thought to look at my own footprints.
yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. So it's likely that Mr. and Mrs. Thor both died during the heat of the late afternoon on the same day that they had arrived at the gorge. So it's not thought that they survived a particularly long time. So the next morning, 2 tourists noted that the rental car was still parked in the day-use car park.
And parked badly.
They didn't report that, but the tourists reported them missing to the ranger who was off duty that day. So the tourists then left a note on the hire car just saying, hey, we've noticed that you've been parked here the last day. Like, we've reported you missing.
Right.
To the rangers, like, just in
case they
come back. Yeah. So as the ranger was off duty, he was on the way to Alice Springs with his family. On his return from Alice Springs that afternoon, he went to investigate whether the car was still there, and he noticed it was the same car that he'd seen double parked the day before. So he drove to the ranger station, got a quad bike, and rode through the gorge to the boundary. He noticed footprints going past the boundary, and he followed the footprints until he noticed one set of footprints left the creek bed, and he followed those footprints for a few kilometres until it began to get dark. He then returned to the station, reported the issue to his supervisor, and contacted the police. The police prepared for a search and rescue the next day. They traced the vehicle to a hire company and obtained the identities of Mr. and Mrs. Thor. And they also got pictures of them arriving at the Alice Springs airport, so they knew
what they
looked
looked
like.
Yeah.
The police went to Trafina Gorge the next day with a 12-person crew, quad bikes and a helicopter. One of the officers followed the footprints and the others worked in a pattern sweeping the area. However, neither Mr. or Mrs. Thor were found that day. So it must have been fairly rough terrain.
Yeah, and they must have got themselves fairly out of the way as well.
Yeah.
And it makes sense that when you're suffering from heat stroke And you're also looking for shade. So the helicopter's not necessarily going to see you
Mm.
if you're under, like she was under a tree.
Yeah.
And I assume at this point they kind of knew what their outcome was going to be. Like there was kind of no survivable condition at this point, right?
Yeah, so the next day they went back out, and at that point they were of the belief that it was no longer a search and rescue. But yeah, they sort of said there's very little chance that the couple are still alive at this point. So at 12:15 p.m. the next day, the helicopter sighted the body of Mr. Thor. He was recovered, and it was estimated that he had been deceased for at least a few days. So that's, again, how they worked out that he probably died the same day that he went missing. Then the next day, at 12:54 p.m, the helicopter pilot spotted Mrs. Thor. Again, it was estimated that she had passed away at least a few days ago. It was the opinion of the forensic pathologists that both Mr. and Mrs. Thor died of environmental heat injury.
Fair, but also that would have been so hard to determine like 3 days after.
I mean, that's probably why they didn't go into specifics of like dehydration or heat stroke or anything like
Yeah.
that. It was just something from the environment and the heat.
Yeah. I'm guessing it's just like there's no obvious fractures, there's no wounds.
Yeah, it's not obvious that they've had a heart attack while they're out walking or something like that.
No other reasons, so that kind of just leaves.
It's like they died of exposure, basically.
Yeah.
So that's really the incident that occurred that led to the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Thor. I'll go a little bit now into the departmental response to their deaths because they actually were quite proactive in implementing measures following these deaths. So there are 7 parks and reserves that make up the East McDonnell sub-district, covering 38,000 hectares.
Okay.
So the travel to the furthest park is a 450-kilometre drive. So their jurisdiction is really quite
Yeah, because my first question was going to be, do they have any kind of evening checks of car parks and stuff like that? But if it's that big, there's no way they could get around anyway.
Yeah, it's that big, and there's only 2 rangers and 1 caretaker for that whole subdivision.
Yeah,
so
so
there's
not
just
possible.
no way that they can do that. A significant component of the rangers' role is land management, including weed management, fire management, feral animal control, and flora and fauna research and monitoring. So they're not just...
They're not there for people. They're actually there for the land.
Yeah, exactly. So they're there to maintain the land. But obviously, if there's issues with people on it as well, that will assist. But yeah, they've got a massive area to cover between the 3 of them. And it's not their only role to be looking after the people. So February has the least number of visitors to Trafina Gorge. The number increases about tenfold towards the middle of the year during the cooler months. So it was also
that seems fair.
A not common time for people to be visiting. So during that time, rangers are rostered on for 7 days, as in during the cooler months. Rangers are rostered on for 7 days in a row, and they conduct programs for visitors like guided walks, campfire talks, and other activities. However, during the summer months, the rangers are only rostered on during business days. So, I mean, I could have looked it up and seen what day the 10th of February 2017 was, but because he was off duty, I'm assuming it was a weekend. Because they were sort of talking about how he was going into Alice Springs with his family.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. So he wasn't even rostered on to work that day.
It was a Friday.
Oh, okay. So maybe he was rostered on.
2017?
Yeah.
Yeah, 10th of Feb was a Friday.
Okay. So then they were doing the search and rescue on a weekend then.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, he wasn't on duty that day. After the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Thor, the Parks and Wildlife Department conducted a review that identified a number of shortcomings, including the absence of the boundary fence, the inadequacy of the signage and track marking, the inadequacy of safety messaging available to visitors before entering the park, and the lack of mobile or Wi-Fi coverage in the area. Where possible, these issues were investigated and rectified by Parks and Wildlife following the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Thor. So just going through those. In relation to the boundary fence, on the 22nd of January 2017, so a couple of weeks before the incident, Trafina Gorge received 72 millimetres of rain, and the following day another 20 millimetres. On the 24th of January, the fence was inspected. It was still in place, but the laminated sign was damaged and it was immediately replaced at that point.
And then it got washed away. So it's so frustrating. Okay.
On the 25th of January, a further 55 millimetres of rain fell. Trafina Creek was flowing a metre deep over the access road, and the park was closed at that point. It was reopened on the 27th of January to full drives only. and the next day to all vehicles. There was water flowing in the creek until about the 5th of February. So that's 5 days beforehand. And when there was water in the river, it made access to the creek bed and boundary fence by vehicles impossible. So basically all of this was impassable until 5 days
before. Right.
Yeah. So on the 9th of February, fencing repairs were scheduled for the 13th.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so unfortunate.
I assume these tourists weren't keeping up with the weather events the weeks
doubt
before as well.
No.
Not in, because they were visiting so many areas as well. It would have been like, arrive, okay, what's on our list of stuff to do? Yeah, they wouldn't have been
aware
focusing on that.
Yeah.
As a lack of defence was a contributory factor to the Thors becoming lost, Parks and Wildlife put a new procedure in place which included the placing of signs after a flow event warning that the boundary fence may be damaged or missing.
Oh, yeah.
Signs were also placed on the trees across the creek to alert visitors that the boundary of the park was approaching and no access was permitted past that point. So,
that's a good idea.
extra signs on the trees, less likely to
get that far. Okay.
Exactly. At the beginning of November 2018, in response to the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Thor and also 2 other deaths that occurred in the same area due to heat issues, a Beat the Heat safety campaign was launched. It was launched on Facebook, and there's a fact sheet on the anti-government website, as well as posters and leaflets provided to tourism information centres, car hire companies and accommodation providers in the area.
Seems fair.
Which is reasonable because remember, they're tourists from Germany. They came out, which would have been the middle of their winter to the middle of the Australian summer. You're not going to be acclimatised, and some people just, I think, they know Australia is going to be hot.
Yeah.
But I think they don't quite understand.
And I feel like Alice Springs is like a really different climate to the rest of Australia as well because it's in the centre that it's very, very hot during the day but very, very cold overnight. Like the temperature fluctuation between heat of the day and cool of the night is so extreme as well that I think that creates that extra element to it as well.
Yeah, because they got up at 6 a.m. in the morning.
Yeah,
and
it would have been quite cool at that point.
Warm.
Yeah.
They'd be like, oh, it might be a cool day. All of a sudden it's 40 degrees and they're just in the middle of a gorge.
And if you've never been in 40 degrees before, I don't think you can imagine what it feels like.
Yeah.
And it's dry heat as well.
Just
true.
baking,
So dry
and you're
out.
in a creek bed. Like there's
I doubt
rocks
there'd be
everywhere.
Yeah.
A lot of reflection of the sun.
Yeah, just a lot of
not wearing sun protection.
Yeah.
not carrying enough water.
Not wearing the right shoes.
The carrying of the water. They didn't mean to go that far, but even so, I still think 600 mils is not enough for, even if they'd done the short 500 metre walk in that heat.
Yeah, a litre each.
Yeah.
If not more.
But again, we grew up here. We know
Yes.
that kind of extreme heat.
Exactly.
And so that's very
why
common for us.
They put out these information flyers. I haven't looked at them, but probably saying the exact same thing of, hey,
It gets really fucking hot.
it gets really hot. Like, carry enough water for you to make it there and back and wear a hat and don't go in the middle of the day. All those things that we know not to do.
Yeah.
That this couple unfortunately did do. So in regards to the telephone reception and Wi-Fi to the area, there was consideration by Parks and Wildlife of personal location beacons. I thought it was a little bit far. But anyway, they came to the conclusion that it's unlikely that visitors would hire or buy a beacon for such a trip to the park like Trafina Gorge, unless they were doing a longer walk. Like, you're not going to spend money and hire a beacon to go for a 500-metre stroll.
Yeah, you're not expecting to get lost. Trevor definitely should have had an EPIRB.
Yeah.
These guys, it makes sense they didn't.
Yes, Trevor, we've very much said, should have done a lot of things.
Yes.
I definitely agree with that, though. If they only thought they were going to be going for a very short walk, they would not have wanted an EPIRB.
No.
Yeah.
No, that's
Did it go into whether they had mobile phones with them?
It didn't talk about whether they had mobile phones with them, but the family, so the children came up with an idea that visitors should be encouraged to download a maps feature on their phone and make sure that the maps are available offline as well, so that when Wi-Fi is not available, like it's not available in the gorge, that they would at least have some navigation tool.
But how well detailed are those trails on like Google Maps?
Well, apparently pretty well
detailed,
because the coroner as part of the inquest, went to Trafina Gorge and downloaded one of the apps on his phone and used it to navigate
and it was
through
helpful.
the park and said that it worked.
Because the other question I had was around like their English language skills. So all the signs that are being put up presumably are in English. Were there many issues in terms of their English language that might have become a barrier for them, or that these new signs and stuff may not have actually helped?
They didn't go into the English literacy at all, but a lot of the signs that were there were just like arrows anyway.
Yeah.
So they weren't written.
So
it was just sort of go this way.
Yeah.
And I also feel like no matter what language the sign is in, if you come up to a fence that has a sign on it, you'd be like, I'm guessing I'm not meant to. And usually there's like the image of the person.
New stuff up on the trees before the boundary fence.
Yeah.
And so it's like,
true.
What is that? If it's just a circle with a cross through it and it's on a tree, is it like,
hopefully
don't climb this tree, or is it like, don't go beyond here?
Yeah. So the coroner commented, this is in relation to the Maps app, that at the time of the inquest, Parks and Wildlife seemed ambivalent to recommending the use of such an app as technology might fail, which seems like a very...
Like, yes, it might. But if it doesn't, it's very helpful.
Yeah, exactly. That's not a great reason to be like, we're not going to do that because it could fail.
But also, like, are you saying everyone should come pick up a paper map?
Yeah, but even if you have a paper map, for me, if I've wandered off the trail, I don't know where I am on the map.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't give me GPS.
Yes.
Whereas at least you got GPS with the phone.
Yeah.
Talking of reception, though, I don't think they will have fixed the reception problem because I still don't get reception in Alice Springs, let alone outside in the gorge or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, that's not something that
unless you're in Telstra, you are fucked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, as I said, during the course of the inquest, the coroner, he visited Trafina Gorge, used an app and used it to navigate around, and he commented that it was free, it was easy to download, and it was accurate throughout the visit.
Huh.
So following that visit, the department stated that they would then be happy to recommend a GPS app as an option.
As if it took the coroner going to do that, though. That is concerning.
Well, to be fair, they did implement a lot of other things.
Yeah, fair. Okay.
And we're
pretty
proactive
about it. Okay.
It was just like maybe technology was a little step too far. They're like, we're happy to put up signs and fences and be proactive about that, but maybe like the technology is a little bit too far. But the coroner did comment that he was impressed by Parks and Wildlife's responsiveness and commended them on their comprehensiveness of their response and speedy implementation of the changes.
Nice.
He was still pretty impressed by them, even though that one little sticking point was a bit odd. The coroner was also impressed with the thoughtful approach of the family to the issues surrounding the death of their parents. So some of the relatives flew down for the inquest from Germany and attended the Trafina Gorge site visit with the coroner as well. So they all sort of
they went on a road trip together.
Yeah, it probably would have been good for them to get a better understanding of how this happened and how sort of easy it can be.
It's hard to imagine when you've not been to those kinds of locations before.
It is hard to conceptualize, especially, I've never been to Germany, so I don't know what the landscape is there, but I'm assuming it's quite different to what it's like here in Australia. And it'd be quite hard to conceptualize. Like, they say that they walked about 5 kilometres by the time they really realised they were lost. And then, like, the mother walked 10 kilometres, which, if you're thinking about just walking along the road or whatever, like most people would be able to walk 10 kilometres, maybe not easily, but you'd be able to walk it without perishing.
Yes.
So unless you sort of understand how hard the terrain is out there and how hot and how unkind everything is out there, it might be a bit difficult to conceptualise.
Absolutely. But yeah, Alice Springs and that area of Australia is punishing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. So just because this is a bit of a shorter one, I decided to include this bit in because it gave me the feels.
Aww.
But as part of the report, the coroner included a statement which was made by one of the Thor's sons, Matthias, and this is an oral statement, so if there are grammatical errors, that's why. But I plan to read it out because, it was quite touching. So Matthias said, "So my parents were an active and dedicated couple who really loved travelling and visiting foreign countries. So they really loved being in the nature, spending time with all the activities like hiking and walking. So in the recent years since they had retired, they travelled destinations like the United States, Canada, Namibia, South Africa, and when they planned their trip to Australia and asked me about my experiences, I always told them, you will love this country even more. And what we know from emails and messages that they have sent during the first week, they really enjoyed the trip. When heading from Adelaide to Alice Springs, the week they spent in the Red Centre was supposed to be the highlight of their trip. Then the journey came to a sudden end here at Trafina Gorge. So since those things happened, we have been in permanent contact with the authorities and the coroner's office to get as much information as possible, because I think it's human nature that, in cases like this, you like to get answers to questions like what exactly happened and why it happened. In this particular case, under these circumstances, it was pretty clear to us that from the beginning there were a lot of questions we will never get answered. We have been provided with a lot of information, including the coronial brief, but when they have informed us about the inquest and the chance to attend here, it was not easy to make the decision to attend or not, because sometimes it can be hard to go through all these things again, more than 1.5 years after they happened. But to attend this inquest here was definitely the right decision, because we are very impressed by the detailed investigation and how serious all the involved parties are taking this. The deaths of my parents was a tragedy for us, and it's not to blame somebody, an institution, or even a particular person. So the only thing we can do is learn from it and to do our best to avoid these tragedies so they will never happen again. So, for example, it was very good to see this morning during the on-site visit that a lot of recommendations regarding the signage in the park had been implemented already. For us personally, it was also very good to listen to the people involved here, because it makes a difference between reading it through a statement or a report and listening to a person talking about this. So we're pretty sure that attending this inquest will help us a lot get over these things. Finally, I don't want to miss an opportunity to say thank you to all the Northern Territory authorities and to all the people of Alice Springs for all the support and the sympathies we have received during these hard times. This is something I always mention whenever people are asking me about the deaths of my parents. We met a lot of very nice people here in Alice Springs, and we have even made new friends. This is something we will never forget. Thank you.
Aww. That is...
Yeah.
But also just so well put in terms of like absolutely what a coronial inquest should be.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just a great summary of the reasons why coronial inquests are undertaken.
Yeah,
is to get to the bottom of things. It's not necessarily to blame people, although sometimes that is necessary.
But it's to try and get answers where you're not sure what they are, and then if you don't know that you've done everything you can to get to it. Yeah.
And I think as well as he sort of put it is it's different reading things off a page than it is to actually go there and experience it and listen to people.
Yeah.
And be like, oh, okay, I understand now how this could have happened. And I understand now exactly what you're doing, and seeing where they've put the signs and how they're trying to improve things, and actually seeing it with your own eyes and being like, oh, they're actually doing something, because both of his parents died.
Yeah. And maybe even when it comes down to why did it take them so long to find them, once you've been in that location, you can be like, okay, yeah, I see why
it took so long.
Yeah.
Because they were in this massive area and we didn't know where. It was searching for the proverbial needle in a haystack. Maybe not that bad, but
pretty damn close. You could have assumed that they might have been near the trail, but they also equally might not have been.
No, exactly. And they didn't give up. They searched for 3 or 4 days.
Yeah, they knew they had to be somewhere.
Yeah.
And that search would have also been in equally horrendous conditions in terms of like 40 degrees.
Yeah.
The search and rescue crew would have also been going through incredibly tough weather.
And it must also be so hard being in search and rescue in cases where you're not likely to find someone alive.
Yeah.
Because you know what you're looking for is going to be grisly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that must be really hard as well.
Absolutely.
So the coroner made just one recommendation in relation to this inquest, that the Department of Tourism and Culture do all such things as may be necessary to advise visitors who may visit its parks in areas without reception or Wi-Fi of the existence of GPS apps and the use to which they might be put when visiting those areas. So basically just recommending for everyone to download an app.
Yep.
Now that we have technology to do so, do it.
Exactly, yeah.
It's the easiest way to keep yourself safe.
And it's a fallback method. Like, you don't have to use it if you don't need it, but in the event where you do get lost, just pull out your phone.
Yep.
And have a look.
I wonder if eventually we will get to essentially, like, phones will be EPIRBs that you essentially could use.
They kind of are now.
But if you're out of reception.
Yeah, true.
So I'm like, I wonder whether eventually that technology will exist where like EPIRBs just will cease to exist because you just have your own mobile device that will do that anyway.
Potentially, I think would need to be a lot more well connected.
Yeah, it's not around the corner, but I think it's certainly in the future. I wonder at what point you realise and then use it. If they'd had an EPIRB, what difference would it have made for them? You're not really sure.
But also, who's able to respond to those emergency signals?
Yeah, true. At the moment, we've talked about those cases. They all go through Canberra first. The RCC are the ones who pick up that signal for the... Is it for the EPIRBs? I think
because that was the plane one as well, but that was back in 2000.
True.
And that was the locator beacon for the plane.
Yeah. I covered one that was a personal device as well.
Yeah, the Kenyan one.
The personal device still went through Canberra as well, and that was more recently. Yeah.
Did at least at that point. So yeah, that was a shorter one, but
had some really interesting and good points and highlights, and it's sad when it's tourists, hey.
Yeah. And I don't know, I've got a little bit of a soft spot for elderly people as well.
Yeah. Because they're just out enjoying their retirement as well, right?
And they just seems like they just had everything planned to a T, were very organised, had been to so many different countries before.
Which kind of shocks me then that they weren't organised in terms of knowing what they needed for this. The fact that they're doing an education campaign now to encourage tourists to gain that understanding is really helpful because, these are what we think might have been the most prepared tourists out there.
Well, in terms of travelling experience.
But having things down to a T, knowing that they were going to the gorge to see some painted rocks to do this thing. So if they've done that much reading, one would have hoped that along the way they would have discovered that it's generally quite hot. You need to over-prepare in terms of water, but yet they didn't potentially come across that information because we think that they would have otherwise taken that on board. So it is really good that they are therefore trying to improve that education out there then.
And I think in this case, obviously the issue is they got lost.
Obviously.
Yeah.
But they started underprepared. It's
like you've got to be prepared to get lost almost and be prepared for that sort of scenario.
Yeah.
Because obviously they thought they were just going to be out for...
But they didn't even have hats on.
No.
And that kind of stuff like that for me is... In Alice Springs, if you're going to go for a walk, especially in summer, but even in winter, you're going to want some sun safety.
You need sun protection. I think always people who visit Australia
don't
you
realise.
always get told like the Australian sun is worse.
But no one listens.
Yeah, no one listens until they get burnt.
Well, because like if you're from the UK or Europe, it's like, it gets hot here.
Yeah.
But the sun isn't as burny.
Yeah.
The sun's going to bite you. And we don't know how necessarily exposed like the walking tracks and things that they're walking on as well.
True. But it's a creek bed, so I imagine there's not a huge amount of trees.
I'm sure it was pretty exposed, so they would have felt it. It would have been hot. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you back next time. Bye.